My name is Scott Schnall. I'm a principal technical writer on the Exchange Server product team at Microsoft. Today we're going to be talking about deployment planning for Exchange Server 2007. We're also going to be talking about deployment planning for the upcoming Service Pack 1 for Exchange 2007 as well. Hopefully we will have time to get to all of your questions at the end, but in case we don't, right after this session I'm going to be at the Exchange booth in the product hall at the reception tonight. I can get to your questions there. Or if you just don't think of them while you're at the show, I've also put my email address up on the slide deck. Feel free to send me any questions that you might have, whether related to this session or anything else you want to know about Exchange Server. Happy to help you out there. So we're going to talk about different things. We're going to talk about the new architecture in Exchange 2007, how we've broken it down into what we call server roles. We're going to talk about some of the hardware guidelines and how they've changed when we go from the RTM to Service Pack 1 version of Exchange 2007. We're also going to be talking about the installation requirements, and not just the installation requirements for Windows Server 2003, but also the installation requirements for Windows Server 2008, once that's available as well. And we're going to talk about some of the key architectural differences in Exchange 2007 that make it pretty different from the version of Exchanges that we've had before. So quick show of hands, how many of you have already deployed Exchange 2007 in your environment? Okay, that's a lot of hands. So for many of you, some of what I'm going to cover you probably already know. You had to, for example, meet certain prerequisites in order to do the deployment. You had to follow certain steps in order to get Exchange installed, and you had to make various decisions along the way to decide what type of topology that you wanted to use. So if some of this stuff is a refresher, that's great. But I think with Service Pack 1 coming out, which I'm told is the most anticipated service pack in Exchange history, we will have some new things that you'll want to be aware of, and I will be covering those in this session. So let's talk about the architectural changes first, then we'll talk about Exchange and its use of Active Directory. We'll get into some hardware guidelines, and as I mentioned, they've changed a little bit in Service Pack 1. We'll talk about the specific requirements that Exchange has above and beyond the requirements that, say, for example, Windows has. And then we'll talk about the installation process itself. So when it comes time to planning for Exchange, it's not the kind of software where you just grab the DVD, put it in a drive, and start installing it. Exchange has some pretty serious implications for your network, and these implications are not new to Exchange 2007. For example, Exchange 2000 and Exchange 2003 also made significant changes to Active Directory, namely the Active Directory schema, and Exchange 2007 is going to make similar changes as well. Now, with Exchange 2007 RTM, there is one set of schema changes. With Service Pack 1, there are additional schema changes that will be made as well. Now, if you haven't yet deployed Exchange 2007 in your environment, you don't need to deploy RTM and then SP1. If you do fresh installs of SP1, all the schema changes are in there for both RTM and SP1. Everything is cumulative, and you don't have to worry about an iterative or a step-by-step process. We've also changed our permissions model quite a bit in Exchange 2007. In Exchange 2000 and 2003, we didn't have a very granular delegation model when it came to permissions. You either needed a whole lot of permissions to do even somewhat basic tasks, or you just couldn't do any tasks and you had certain view-only or read-only levels of permissions. We have a new permissions model that we call the split permissions model in Exchange 2007, and it works on establishing different property sets based on the properties in Active Directory. You have Exchange property sets and you have Active Directory property sets, and by separating these two property sets, we can apply Exchange security permissions on the Exchange property sets, and then free up the permissions on the Active Directory property sets, which some messaging administrators might not need to deal with. Now, when it comes to Active Directory, it's used by 4 out of the 5 server roles: the mailbox server role, the hub transport server role, the unified messaging server role, and the client access server role. There is a 5th server role, the edge transport server role, that does not directly communicate with Active Directory. This is a special new type of server role that's intended to live outside of your corporate network in what we call a perimeter network. We used to call it a DMZ, but we don't use that term anymore because it's not globally localizable. So when you hear the term perimeter network, that's what we're talking about. But Edge is meant to be your internet-facing SMTP gateway, and for it to be able to do its job, it does need to have a certain amount of information that is stored in Active Directory. And so for Edge, we have a synchronization process that we call Edge synchronization. And the Edge server talks to a hub transport server in an Active Directory site in your organization and gets a one-way synchronization of some of the data that's held in AD. For instance, recipient information. You want to make sure that only messages get through the Edge server that are for actual recipients in your global address list, in your Active Directory. Well, the way for Edge to do that is to get that information. But since Edge isn't directly connected to Active Directory, we have to have this mechanism for it to do so. And it's in fact a very secure mechanism. It sends it one way in encrypted format, and when the information is stored in a special version of Active Directory called ATOM, or Active Directory in application mode, it's stored in a one-way hash as well. So this way, if the Edge transport server is compromised, stolen, or whatever, the information that comes from Active Directory that's now stored in this ATOM instance is not discoverable, crackable, or hackable. So it's very secure. Now, when you're deploying Exchange 2007 or Service Pack 1 into the environment, you do have to have Windows Server 2003 domain controllers and global catalog servers. Now, you need at least one in every site in which you're going to deploy Exchange in the RTM version. Now, in the RTM version, one of the things that we did is we would go out and we would try to talk to every single domain that you had in your forest. And if there were domains that didn't meet these prerequisites, even if you never intended on installing Exchange in these domains, Exchange setup would block and you'd be stopped and you'd have to do some workaround to hide these domains and hide these legacy domain controllers from Exchange. I'll talk about later how we've addressed that and fixed that problem in Service Pack 1. But you still need Windows Server 2003 with Service Pack 1 on at least the schema master in the organization and at least one domain controller and global catalog server in each site. Now, preferably, you're going to be running Service Pack 2 for Windows Server 2003, but it's not a requirement for the global catalog servers or for the domain controllers. It's only a requirement for the Exchange servers. Now, you do have to have a domain level functionality of Windows Server 2000, or Windows 2000 native or higher. Otherwise, you won't be able to introduce Exchange into that domain. When it comes time to DNS, obviously Exchange is very ingrained in DNS. It needs DNS name resolution in order to send mail, in order to receive mail, in order to communicate with other servers. But there's some other nuances to DNS that are needed as well. I talked about the Edge synchronization process where the Edge transport server talks to the hub transport server inside the organization to get this data from Active Directory. Well, in order to do that, the Edge transport server has to have DNS resolution of that hub transport server. Okay, now this is something that you may set up through the use of a host file. It may be something that you set up through split DNS, or it may be something where you're actually publishing the DNS addresses or the IP addresses of your hub transport servers to a DNS server that the Edge transport server is using. However you do it, the choice is yours, but you do have to have that name resolution. The other thing you're going to want DNS name resolution for is a feature called Auto Discover. Auto Discover is brand new in Exchange 2007, and it's a way in which a client such as Microsoft Office Outlook 2007 can automatically detect and discover the mailbox server containing the user's mailbox. The user only needs to enter in their email address and their password, and from there the system goes out and it looks for information about where that mailbox is located. And of course, it needs DNS to do some of that work. The other thing you need is a single unified namespace. And what we mean by that is you cannot have a disjointed DNS namespace and install Exchange into that namespace. It's unfortunately just something that we don't support, but fortunately it's something that not a lot of people are using. But we do find that some customers are using it, and if that applies to you, you're going to want to reevaluate your DNS and make sure you turn it into a single unified namespace. And then finally, on the Edge transport server itself, you want to go in and add the DNS suffix for the Edge transport server. And you want to do that before you establish the Edge synchronization subscription. If you try to go back and you add the suffix after you've established this Edge sync subscription, Edge synchronization will break, and you'll have to break the subscription and reestablish it after adding that DNS suffix into it. And for those of you who don't know, the DNS suffix is something where you go into the computer name properties and you go into the advanced naming properties and you give it the DNS suffix, and then you choose whether or not to make that DNS suffix change when the domain membership of the Edge transport server changes. And we'll talk about the Edge transport server's domain membership in a minute. Now, when it comes to choosing the right hardware for Exchange, it's really based on many, many factors. We have a lot of guidance that tells you what processors you're going to want to pick, what memory configurations we think you should use, and what storage configurations work best for Exchange. And we have it all consolidated in one area under this planning your server and storage architecture. So if you go into there, you'll find all of our latest guidance for both RTM and SP1 on all those hardware sizing mechanisms. Now, when it comes time to work out what you want to do with the individual server roles, there's going to be some additional planning that you'll want to do depending on what server role features you want to leverage. For instance, let's start with the mailbox server role. This is really the core server role upon which all other server roles are predicated. All the other server roles are effectively useless in the organization without an Exchange 2007 mailbox server role. So the mailbox server role is very important. It's where the mailboxes and the public folders are. It's where the end user data is. Now you've got some decisions to make when it comes to the mailbox server role. It's the only server role that can be clustered, so are you going to deploy a standalone server, or are you going to deploy a clustered mailbox server? Which, by the way, is the new term. We no longer use the term Exchange Virtual Server to represent an Exchange server that's deployed in a cluster. We have a much more simpler term. We simply call it a clustered mailbox server. What kind of makes things interesting, though, is now, unlike previous versions of Exchange, we have two kinds of clusters. We have a legacy shared storage cluster. We call that a single copy cluster, and we actually chose that name to specifically designate that this kind of cluster only has a single copy of the data inside the cluster. The second kind of cluster does not use shared storage, and it's a very different kind of cluster. It's called cluster continuous replication. Now, unlike a single copy cluster, which can be up to 8 nodes, 7 of them active, at least 1 passive, cluster continuous replication is always 2 nodes, 1 active and 1 passive. And they don't share storage. Instead, they each have their own independent copy of storage, and we do log shipping and replay between the 2 of them. Now, I don't want to steal any thunder. There's a great high availability session coming up later in the week, and I would strongly recommend that you go see it because you're going to hear everything you wanted to hear about both single copy clusters and cluster continuous replication. But you have some decisions to make. Which one are you going to use, CCR or SCC? And I think most people will maybe come to the conclusion that CCR is going to be a better model because unlike a single copy cluster, with CCR, you have 2 online copies of your data. So you've got the second online copy that is now your first line of defense in the event something happens to your active copy or your production copy. Then above and beyond that, we have this log shipping in other forms as well. I mentioned it in the cluster form, but we also have a form called local continuous replication. That's log shipping to a second set of disks connected to the same server as the original set of disks. Doesn't require the Enterprise Edition like it does with clustering, but it also doesn't provide you service availability because both sets of disks, both copies of the data, are tied to one single standalone server. If that server goes down, the data is inaccessible. We also are introducing a third kind of replication called standby continuous replication. And it's the same kind of continuous replication we have in LCR and CCR, but it has some significant differences that, again, you'll hear a lot about in the high availability and in the site resilience and disaster recovery session later in the week. And of course, there's also third-party replication. One of the reasons we continue to support the single copy cluster paradigm is because there's a lot of customers out there who've successfully deployed these types of clusters, and they put third-party replication technology on top of it. And so they're used to that, and they like it, and that's the type of replication that they prefer to use. In part because that type of replication is typically lossless, whereas the type of replication we have, because it's asynchronous, could result in data loss, although it's typically a very small amount of data loss. And of course, you have all numbers of storage choices. We've done so much work in Exchange 2007 that we've really opened possibilities, and we've opened doors to new ways of thinking about storage. In Exchange 2003 and earlier versions, we found that the typical customer spent about 80% of their capital costs just on the storage solution alone. When we moved to the 64-bit version of Exchange 2007, now that opened the door because with all this much more addressable memory space, we can do a lot more work in memory. We don't have to do so much work in disk. So you have this significant reduction of IOPS, and this reduction of IOPS translates into more storage options. Now, direct attached storage, iSCSI storage, they're viable alternatives to storage area networks. You don't have to buy expensive storage anymore. And I actually have a storage session for Exchange 2007 and Service Pack 1 later on this week where I'm going to drill into why that is and what our recommendations are specifically, for storage. You also need to decide what you're going to do with public folders. And there's been some confusion about public folders and what our long-term strategy is for them. Now, let's make no mistake, we do have a long-term strategy for collaboration, but we are looking further down the road. With respect to public folders, we have a support life cycle in our products of 10 years. Exchange 2007 came out at the end of last year. That means public folders are at least supported until the year 2016. So now you need to decide for yourself if you're going to continue public folders or if you want to leverage investments in, say, SharePoint Portal Server or some other product that gives you the collaboration that people typically use public folders for. But public folders aren't going away anytime soon, so you do have some decisions to make as to whether or not you're going to use them. And we have said publicly as early as last year, at last year's US Tech Ed, that public folders will likely also be in the next version of Exchange beyond Exchange 2007. So again, decide whether or not you want to use them. There's no pressure to move away from them, but be assured that long term, we are looking away from public folders for collaboration and for applications. Okay, so that's the mailbox server role. The next server role that you're going to need is the hub transport server role. And even though we call these server roles, we do have the ability for you to take individual server roles and combine them on the same physical server. And there's really only two exceptions to that. One is only the mailbox server role can be installed in a failover cluster. You can't cluster any of the other roles. And the other exception is that the edge transport server role can't be combined with any other server roles. Edge has to live on its own, by itself, again, in a perimeter network. Now, the hub transport server role, that is designed out of the box to use Active Directory sites for routing. We finally got away from a separate Exchange routing topology. In Exchange 2007, we introduced the use of Active Directory site topology for routing. Now, we did preserve the ability for Exchange administrators to go in and override this topology if they preferred to route messages differently from the way they've laid out Active Directory. But if you don't want to do that, there's nothing that you need to do. You just simply install Exchange and it will automatically detect your Active Directory topology using the new Active Directory topology service. And it will not only detect it, but it will also feed that detection of the Active Directory topology to other components in Exchange and use some smart routing based on the state of that topology. To get the built-in resilience for the mailbox server role, of course, we have clustering and we have continuous replication. For hub, it's even simpler. All you need to do is introduce at least 2 or more hub transport servers in the site, and you have automatic resiliency and load balancing between them. If one of the hub transport servers goes down, there's nothing whatsoever an administrator needs to do in order to reestablish mail flow. Mail flow will automatically occur to surviving hub transport servers. And you'll see that that simple story of redundancy is really the linchpin of the Exchange high availability solutions. Redundancy is key to maintaining service availability and to maintaining data availability. With respect to the client access server role, some people have called that the next generation front-end server. It's not really entirely accurate, but I can see why it's called that way. For one thing, it's serving up all the client access protocols you're used to. Outlook Web Access, ActiveSync, POP, and IMAP. But it's very different in terms of the underlying technology and the underlying communication protocols that a front-end server would typically use versus what a client access server uses. Now, when it came to Exchange 2000 and 2003, it was, much to our dismay, kind of a common practice for customers to take a front-end server and put it out in one of these perimeter networks. The idea being that you only expose that port 443 to the internet and nothing else got through. The problem with that, though, is that that front-end server was an Active Directory connected server. It didn't matter that there was only one port coming into it from the internet. It still needed communication with the other Exchange servers, but it also needed communication with Active Directory, which meant on the other side of the firewall separating the perimeter network and the corporate network, you had to open a whole bunch of ports, and you had to statically assign RPC ports and do all this convoluted work just to get it to function the way it should have functioned had you put it inside the corporate network. Well, with 2007, we drew a line in the sand and we said, you know what, Active Directory connected systems, particularly those that run Exchange, do not belong in perimeter networks. And so now we don't support putting the client access server into a perimeter network. Now, that doesn't mean you can't put firewalls in between your Exchange servers, but what we are saying is that the client access server does need unfettered access to Active Directory, and it has to be on a highly connected segment so it can talk to the mailbox server, because unlike prior versions, the client access server now talks MAPI to the mailbox server. And of course, it's encrypted MAPI, so everything's nice and secure. But still, the point is it's RPC-based MAPI, and you need to make sure that you've got a very fast connection, in other words, a LAN-based connection between these servers. Now, the unified messaging server role, that is brand new to Exchange. That is Exchange merging with the telephony equipment inside of your organization. And that can be a little bit intimidating for some administrators. There's a whole lot of telephony terms that the messaging administrator needs to learn, and there are some messaging terms that the telephony administrators will need to learn as well. Historically, these are two teams that typically didn't talk to one another. The telephony team managed the PBXs and whatnot. The messaging team handled the messaging service, and very often these teams didn't even know each other. But now they are getting to know each other, and they're getting to know each other because they're putting their solutions together. We have a wide variety of partners who make voice over IP gateways or IP PBXs or regular PBXs that will integrate with Exchange Unified Messaging. And hopefully, as you saw in the Service Pack 1 overview, we'll further extend that integration into Office Communication Server 2007 as well. And finally, there's the Edge Transport Server role, the fifth of the server role. This is the server role that can actually be introduced anytime into the organization. You don't have to have Exchange 2007 on the inside of your organization yet, although you will not get the full power of Edge until you have an Exchange 2007 hub transport server inside the organization and a subscription is established. Now, it's designed specifically for a perimeter network deployment. Reduced attack surface, it's not joined to the corporate Active Directory, it is completely out there, just acting as a secure SMTP gateway for messages coming in from the internet. You can also route messages outgoing through it as well, but it really shines for messages coming in from the internet. Now, it's not a member of the internal Active Directory, it's not a member of the internal domain or the internal forest. But what you can do, and in fact this is what MSIT does, is you can take an Edge Transport server and you can put it in a perimeter network forest. And this means once it's in a perimeter network forest and domain, you now can manage it using group policy and other Windows management features as well. So keep that in mind, that this is a common misperception. People I've heard say, no, Edge doesn't belong in a domain. What we're really saying is it doesn't belong in the internal domain. You can certainly make it a member of an extranet forest. It's a completely separate forest. There's no trust relationship where this extranet forest is trusted by the internal forest at all. It's completely separate, but it's a forest deployed specifically for management purposes, and that is very useful when you have a lot of Edge Transport servers that you need to manage, especially when you're using group policy. Now, as I mentioned, it doesn't connect to Active Directory itself. Instead, it uses a special kind of Active Directory in application mode, which is like Active Directory itself, except it's outside the LSA process, and it's a standalone application. It's a set of services that can be turned on and off. But it's still Active Directory. It's still got the same classes, the same schema, extensions. It's still programmatically accessible through Active Directory Services interface. It's just like Active Directory because it's just outside the LSA process as a standalone directory server. Okay, standalone directory server. That's another key criteria. Unlike Active Directory, the instance on Atom on one Edge Transport server does not replicate to instances of Atom on other transport servers. Now, we do have a script called clone config, and you can take the configuration from one Edge Transport server and clone it to multiple Edge Transport servers. But this is something that the administrator needs to do themselves. It's not something that's happening through any kind of Atom replication because there is no Atom replication. And as I mentioned, it's a very minimal attack surface. You just need two ports open. Obviously, you need TCP port 25. That's where the SMTP mail is coming in. And then for the Edge sync, you just need TCP port 50636. Those are the only two ports that you would have to open on the firewall. Now, if you're not using group policy or you don't have physical access to the edge transport server in order to do management, you certainly can open up an optional port for RDP. By default, it's 3389, but you don't have to use the default port if you don't want to. If you prefer to go into the registry on the edge transport server, you can go in and modify that port number to be any available port that you want. And just remember to use that port when you're connecting with the terminal services client or the remote desktop client when you're reaching out to that box. But the RDP port's optional. It's not something that you need like the other two ports. Now, one of the major architectural changes we made was moving from a 32-bit world into a 64-bit world. Now, the 64-bit, what we mean by that is the x64 architecture. We don't, for example, support Itanium. It's got to be x64 architecture, either EMT or EM64T or AMD 64. Those are the only two platforms we support. And of course, it's got to be the x64 edition of Windows Server. But moving to this 64-bit architecture really opened the door in terms of power and performance, and also opened the door in terms of scalability. For one thing, with the 64-bit version, you can have up to 50 databases per server. Now, you can also have up to 50 storage groups, but there's not a multiplier here. It's not 50 times 50 giving you 2,500 databases. No, it's a maximum of 50 databases per server. And because you can scale up to 50 storage groups, if you are scaling up to 50 databases, that effectively means you're doing one database per storage group, which by coincidence is our best practice for deploying all mailbox servers. Whether you're going to 50 storage groups or whether you're using just 5 storage groups, our best practice is one database per storage group. Now, some of the other benefits are larger mailboxes. In fact, one of the themes that we had during the development process of 2007 was this concept of low-cost, large mailboxes. And by large, we mean 1 gigabyte, 2 gigabyte, 3 gigabyte. There's some people with 10 gigabyte mailboxes at Microsoft. So we're talking very, very large mailboxes, but at a lower cost. And again, that lower cost is directly translated to the fact that we're in a 64-bit environment with access to more memory and the ability to do more work in memory. And as a result of that, we do less work in disk, which means you buy less expensive disk, which is where you get your cost savings. The other side benefit is no more virtual memory fragmentation. That's history in the 64-bit world. In the 32-bit world, it was devastating to an Exchange server. Virtual memory fragmentation is just like file system fragmentation, except there's no defragmentation tool for virtual memory. Once it became fragmented beyond repair, there was only one way to fix it: rebooting the system. And that meant downtime, and that was not a good thing, particularly if the virtual memory fragment happened on a cluster because you were using our old active-active cluster model, which we no longer support. But it wasn't only the clusters that suffered from virtual memory fragmentation. So now, being 64-bit means VMfrag is a thing of the past. You don't have to worry about it. We also have better search, an increase in concurrent connections, an increase in the database cache size, and actually one of the other side effects of having the 50 storage groups is now you have greater aggregate checkpoint depth per user. And that's important because that means that increases the likelihood of dirty pages staying in memory so that they can be updated multiple times before they have to be written to disk. That's a further IOPS savings there as well. Now, when it comes time to memory sizing, there are specific memory requirements that have to be met. Now, we've recently updated these for both the RTM version and Service Pack 1, so these are the latest memory guidelines. And there's 2 sets of guidelines that you need to adhere to. This first set that you see here are the memory guidelines based on the user profile, based on that light, medium, or heavy profile usage. You want to follow these guidelines. Particularly, you have to meet the minimum guidelines in order to be supported based on user profile. But we generally recommend that you follow our recommended guidelines, and then scaling above beyond that, don't go beyond our maximum recommended guidelines. Now, you're probably aware that the 64-bit version of Windows can certainly handle more than 32 gigs worth of memory. But for Exchange 2007 and Service Pack 1, right now, 32 gigs is really the upper limit that we think should go inside of any Exchange server. And the reason for that is once you scale beyond 32 gigs, once you go to 48, for example, or even up to 64, the cost per price performance based on the cost and performance of memory today does not make it economically justifiable to go beyond 32 gigabytes. So what that means is that's the state today. It could change tomorrow as faster memory becomes available, less expensive memory becomes available. You may find us saying that, oh, well, now you can go to 48 gigabytes for the same cost that you may have had 32 gigabytes. And here we've done some work to make it more performant when you do that. So again, these are the memory sizing guidelines based on the user profile. The other set of guidelines are based on the number of storage groups you have. Now these are the RTM numbers. Okay, so this is the first set of numbers that we released with the RTM version, and these are the sets of numbers that we've been maintaining up until about a month ago. So you can see, even beyond the user profile, you still have to meet these memory requirements. So for example, let's say you have 25 storage groups, but your user profile says you only need 10 gigs of memory. Well, you can look on the slide. It says for 25 storage groups, you need to have 14 gigabytes of memory. And that means you have to go to the higher value. Even though your user profile says you need 10, because the number of storage groups you have says you need 14, you need to have 14 in that box. Okay, which means if you're scaling all the way up to 50 storage groups in the Enterprise Edition, excuse me, you need 26 gigs of memory in the RTM version. Notice I said RTM version. Look at what we've done in Service Pack 1. Now, if you scale up to 50 storage groups in Service Pack 1, now you only need 15 gigabytes in the box for those storage groups. So to make the math easy, even though it doesn't work out evenly this way, figure in RTM we were looking at about 512 megs per storage group. Now in SP1, we're looking at about 256 megs per storage group. That's pretty cool, I think. Great cost savings as well. But of course, you have to be running Service Pack 1 in order to meet those requirements. And I will remind you, these are requirements. These are not recommendations. These are actually requirements that have to be met in order for the server to be in a supported configuration. When it comes time to processor recommendations, these are pretty simple. Really, the only ones that are going to scale up is when you have a very high volume hub transport server. What do we mean by high volume? Something around 1 million messages in the queue. If you're sustaining very large queues like that, maybe you're a service provider, a hoster, or you're in a large environment where you are sustaining that, you will need extra memory in your hub transport, or extra processor power in your hub transport server to sustain that. Similarly, with the mailbox server, you can go up to 8 times processor cores for that. That's a real scale-up situation. And again, it's going to be for the real heavy mail profiles and the really robust environments. Some of the additional hardware requirements, of course, you're going to need disk space. You're going to need disk space to lay out Exchange. I've got some screen snapshots I'm going to show you that show you just how much bigger in the file system Exchange 2007 is than its predecessor. Also, if you are using unified messaging, for every language pack that you install, you need an additional 500 megabytes of space. You need at least 200 megabytes free in the system partition. Everything has to be NTFS. We don't support any other file systems. It's all got to be NTFS. And I also wanted to reiterate our page file recommendations because that's a common question that comes up. Typically, people are used to the RAM plus 10 page file guidelines, and then they get concerned, well, I've just put 20 gigabytes of memory inside my box, so now I need a 20 gigabyte plus 10 size for my page file. So we do have recommendations. If you do have less than 8 gigabytes in the box, we do recommend sticking with the RAM plus 10. Now, as a minimum. You can do 1.5 times RAM, but keep in mind, the purpose of the page file is really twofold. One, it's to give the Windows system an area where it can page out to in case it runs out of physical memory. So even though you have gobs and gobs of physical memory in there, you still need a page file. It just goes to the way Windows works with it, commit charges and whatnot, and there's just no going around it. You still need a page file. The other reason it's there is so that a memory dump file can be created in the event of what? No one wants to shout it out because you've never seen one. A blue screen. Blue screen of death. I guess it's new to all of you. No one got that. If you do that, there's going to be this dump file that gets created, and that dump file can actually be analyzed, and we can figure out why this blue screen happened and what the problem is. There's a lot of great information in there that can be sifted through, and the solution can be found as a result of that. Now, we have an interesting conundrum, though. Now you have a 20 gigabyte page file, and you've called PSS, and they say, okay, the server just blue screened, and oh yeah, I've got the dump here. Yeah, it's 22 gigabytes. Should I just email that to you? Yeah, so now you've got the implications of how do I get this thing to them? You know, it may take a while to upload it via HTTP. It may take a while to upload it FTP. Don't email it because, hey, it's not going to go through any email system we have. But you will have to find some clever way of transmitting that file to support professionals in case you do need some sort of diagnosis. You may find that the support professional may be more inclined to reach out to your system and have the debugging tools put on your system, and analysis can be done that way. There are also some partner technologies that we have and products that are out there that do tremendous work in the area of compression and file transmission. And so there may be options available to you, but just keep in mind the way in which you'll transmit a page file to us is very different from what you've done in the past. Okay, so we've talked about the hardware requirements now. Let's talk about the software requirements. Well, for production users, it's got to be Windows Server 2003, x64, with either SP1 or R2 or Service Pack 2. Now, this is actually a combination of requirements for RTM and SP1. RTM only requires up to SP1 of Windows 2003. But for SP1 of Exchange 2007, you have to have SP2 of Windows 2003, or of course Windows 2008 when that's available. For the prereqs, you also need the Microsoft.NET Framework 2.0, and we actually recommend Service Pack 1 for that. And if you're not using Service Pack, we do recommend the hotfix from 942.027. We recommend that for all Exchange 2007 servers. So if you don't have this hotfix on your Exchange servers, you definitely want to get that hotfix on your Exchange servers. It's recommended for all of them. You also need the Windows PowerShell. You also need the Microsoft Management Console, and there's some other hotfixes and updates that you're going to need as well. And setup is going to do a pretty good check of checking for all of these things. And if some things are missing, you won't be able to proceed. For example, if Microsoft Management Console is not there, setup's going to block you. It won't go any farther without that. But if that last hotfix, the 942.027, isn't available, setup's not going to block you. It will warn you that it's recommended and suggest that you go get it, and even provide you with the download link for you to get it, but it's not going to block you. Okay, so there's some prereqs that will be hard blockers, some that will be recommendations. You absolutely want to review them all. Obviously, the hard blockers have to be resolved before you can move forward, but you also want to carefully look at our recommendations, and hopefully you'll be following them because we make them obvious for obvious reasons. Now, we've been talking about the 64-bit version, but yes, there is a 32-bit version of Exchange 2007, including a 32-bit version of Service Pack 1. Now, we do have limited support in production for 32-bit. When it comes time to 32 versus 64-bit, 64-bit server roles must be run in production, but 32-bit management tools can be used in production. You can use them to manage your Exchange environment, and you can even use them to extend the Active Directory schema. Above and beyond that, there is absolutely no support for 32-bit in production, so do not use it for your server roles in any of your production servers. Now, it's great for labs, it's great for demos, it's great for running in virtual environments, it's great for training exercises and whatnot, and in fact, that's why we have the 32-bit version. So people without 64-bit hardware could get a hold of the software and start learning and start playing with it. Now, there is some functionality that's missing. The 32-bit version is only going to take you to 5 databases. You're not going to get 50 databases like you would with the 64-bit version. You're also not going to be able to get any anti-spam updates. We don't even ship them out to Microsoft Updates, so there's not even a registry hack or some other change that you can make in order to enable these updates. They simply are not put on Microsoft Update. Only updates for 64-bit versions of the Edge Transport Server and Hub Transport Server anti-spam updates are available. Now, one other nuance is that the 32-bit, like the trial version of the 64-bit, has a built-in time bomb. But it's not really a time bomb, it's really a time reminder. And that is, you get a certain amount of time of functionality, and after that time has elapsed, it's 180 days, after that time has elapsed, when you open up the Exchange Management Console, you get a nag box that says, this trial license is expired, you shouldn't be running in this way in production environments. And you'll get that on the 64-bit version as well. Now, if you are running the 64-bit trial version in production, the fix is simple. Just enter the product key, in the case of the mailbox server, restart the information store service, and you've seamlessly moved from the trial edition into the production version, and you're fully supported, and nothing had to be reinstalled or reconfigured. Can't do that with the 32-bit version. There are no keys for the 32-bit version. But what's cool about the 32-bit version is even though it has this 180 days time bomb in it, nothing happens other than that nag dialog. It doesn't shut itself down every hour. It doesn't lose any functionality. All you get is that extra nag dialog. Now let me address this first because this invariably will come up after I mention all you have to deal with is that nag dialog. That's still not satisfactory for people. They still want to know, how can I get rid of that nag dialog? You can't. There's no way to do it. It's programmatically hard-coded in there. Just deal with it. It's much easier to deal with than reinstalling the server, which you don't need to do anyway because you haven't lost any functionality. So keep that in mind. When you're using Exchange in your labs, whether it's the RTM version or you want to take that expired 32-bit trial edition and move it to Service Pack 1, you can do that too. You don't have to reinstall everything. Just do the upgrade on top of it. It's not going to extend the clock, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't need to extend the clock because, again, the only thing that happens after the 180 days is this extra nag dialog. So just keep that in mind. The 32-bit is great. Keep using it for your labs, for your demos. Use the 32-bit admin workstation if you want to. That is supported. Just don't run 32-bit server roles in production. Okay, some of the key differences in beyond moving to 64-bit and beyond scaling out storage groups and whatnot, we have made some key architectural changes in our database engine, in the extensible storage engine. For one thing, there's no more streaming database file. The reason for that is the streaming database file was where the content conversion would take place. Messages would come in MIME format into the store, and they would sit in the streaming file until they were touched with a MAPI client, such as Outlook. At that point, the store was doing the content conversion and promoting that content into the MAPI store, into the EDB file, and getting rid of the copy in the streaming file. Well, one of the architectural changes we made is the content conversion was moved out of the mailbox server role and into the client access server role, where arguably it should have belonged in the first place. Now that the client access server role is doing the content conversion, there's no need for the mailbox server role to have the streaming database file. Therefore, it doesn't exist anymore. Now, one of the other benefits I mentioned, you get that 50 databases and up to 50 storage groups. You get the larger memory, and larger memory in terms of Exchange, particularly for the store, means a much larger cache size as well. Now that the store cache can grow almost infinitely, now you don't have to worry about memory pressure on the database cache causing poor or non-optimal performance. We've also made changes to the page size in Exchange. It used to be a 4K page size, pages in the database. Now it's an 8K page size. We've also reduced the size of log files, transaction log files, and the whole history of Exchange were 5 megabytes, and now in Exchange 2007 and moving forward, they're now 1 megabyte. Now that change was done not so much for performance, but largely to support the continuous replication of the log shipping features that we have in 2007. We did a lot of testing with log file sizes of 5 megs, 2 megs, 10 megs, 1 meg, and we found that 1 meg really worked best in terms of getting enough data off of the box in time, minimizing the amount of data that was lost, and so forth. In fact, it's the data loss minimization that really drove it more than anything. It's not really that much more performant to copy a 1 meg log file than, for example, it is to copy a 2 meg log file. But here, going from a 5 meg log file to a 1 meg log file meant that if any data were lost, it was likely about 5 times less than what you might have lost in a previous version of Exchange. One of the other things that we've done is this thing called I/O coalescing. In Exchange 2003, the system would automatically wait until it had 64K worth of data to write, and then it would go ahead and write that data to disk. That was a great optimization feature. No need to write every bit of data that you get as soon as you get it. You want to wait, hold it, and write it all at once. Well, we've beefed up that feature such that we now coalesce up to 1 meg of data. So yes, we're doing larger writes to disk, but we're doing fewer writes, and that doing fewer writes translates into a reduction in IOPS. We also have failover cluster changes. In Exchange 2003 and Exchange 2000 and so forth, we had this cluster model of active-active, where you had 2 nodes in the cluster and you had 2 Exchange virtual servers, or again, what we now call clustered mailbox servers. Okay, this was an active-active model that, while supported, was very strongly discouraged. The reason it was discouraged is if one of those nodes fail, the other Exchange virtual server would fail over to the surviving node, and now you effectively had 2 Exchange servers running on the same physical server. As you can imagine, that caused all kinds of performance problems. It certainly accelerated virtual memory fragmentation problems, and in most cases, it actually caused a reduction in downtime rather than what you deployed the cluster for in the first place, which was, it caused an increase in downtime, which goes against why you deploy the cluster, which was to get that reduction in downtime. So active-active, we strongly discouraged. There was a whole bunch of restrictions that you had to adhere to when you did it. And finally, in Exchange 2007, with our single copy clusters, we just said, forget it. We're not going to support that anymore. And in fact, now we programmatically block that. Now, what that means is a single node inside a single copy cluster can contain multiple clustered mailbox servers, but at any given time, only one of those clustered mailbox servers can come online. You can't bring 2 or more online on the same node. So we block that. But we do give you the ability to move multiple clustered mailbox servers to the node, because you may need that ability in the event you've got a 3-node cluster and 2 of the nodes are undergoing maintenance, or you've suffered an outage of 2 of the nodes for a variety of reasons, and you need a place to move one of the other clustered mailbox servers. So we now only support active-passive, and of course that applies to both single copy clusters, which again can be up to 8 nodes, 7 of which can be active, but 1 of which must be passive. And in cluster continuous replication, which is always and only active-passive. CCR is always 2 nodes in the cluster and only 2 nodes. One of the nodes is active and one of the nodes is passive. And even though, unfortunately, setup will not block you from introducing additional clustered mailbox servers into there, we don't support that. You can only have the 1 CMS inside a CCR environment. Some of the other differences, I talked about the fact that we're now using Active Directory sites for the routing topology. So that means things like routing groups are no longer needed by Exchange 2007, and in fact they've gone away as a logical unit inside Exchange 2007. Administrative groups have also effectively gone away. With Exchange 2007, all the servers are in the same single administrative group, and they're actually only collected inside an administrative group for legacy purposes, so that Exchange 2000 and 2003 computers in the same organization will know how to deal with these new Exchange 2007 servers. But in a pure Exchange 2000 environment, there are no routing groups, and the single administrative group is really irrelevant because there's nothing in there using it. We've also made a lot of API changes. We had countless numbers of APIs that you could use for programmatic access to Exchange into the stored data. We even went through numerous names. You may recall the web store that we had at one point and so forth. We had CDO, we had WMI, OLADB, variants of CDO and so forth, a lot of different ways. And that, unfortunately, while we were going for very rich programming experiences by choosing the right API to do the right thing, that turned out to be somewhat confusing for developers, because that made them wonder, well, I can get to the store this way, but I can also get there this way. Which way should I use? And then they had a challenge on figuring out the different ways and how to connect them together and so forth. So we've actually made things a lot simpler. We've deprecated a lot of these APIs so that you no longer use them in Exchange. And in replace, we've given you web services as the overarching, the one way that we think is going to be the best way to get at most of the data that you want to get at. Now, there are some raw data method accesses available. OLADB is still there, for instance. But in terms of CDO, WMI, you don't need to use any of that stuff anymore. Now it's web services as the replacement for that. And of course, some of the tools are different. There's no Exchange System Manager anymore. That has now been replaced with a new management console called the Exchange Management Console. How many of you were in the Service Pack 1 overview session right before this one? Okay, almost all of you. For those of you who were in there, you saw the Exchange Management Console, and you saw that we've made it a lot simpler. It's broken out into a static tree, and that's important because in previous versions of Exchange, you could install some connector or some add-on or a third-party product, and now you might have extra levels inside of the user interface that you had to drill down into to find the thing that you wanted to. In some cases, you had to drill down as many as 8 levels just to get to the setting you wanted to view or adjust. In 2007, you'll never have to go more than 3 levels because the tree on the left-hand side is static. It will never change no matter what you install onto the system. It's hard-coded that way. The other thing that we've done is there's no more business logic inside of the management console. All the business logic is now underneath inside of our PowerShell commandlets that are exposed through the Exchange Management Shell. So we have the Windows PowerShell, and on top of that, we have commandlets that are registered in the Exchange Management Shell, and then on top of that sits the Exchange Management Console. In fact, much in the same way the Exchange Management Console is a snap-in to the Microsoft Management Console, so is the Exchange Management Shell a snap-in to the Windows PowerShell. That's exactly the same terms that they use. Now, we are also introducing another management console, the Public Folder Management Console. That is coming in Service Pack 1 as well. This was something that a lot of customers asked us when we released RTM. The only way to manage public folders outside of the Outlook client was to use the Exchange Management Shell. A lot of customers were intimidated by the Exchange Management Shell, even though a lot of those same customers were the ones who were asking us for a command line interface to manage Exchange. So we gave it to them, and we made it pretty easy, but still, and I understand why, it still can be a little bit intimidating to get used to this, especially with a brand new product. You want to get it deployed quickly, you want to get it configured quickly, and if you have to learn how to use the tools in addition to how to deploy and configure this thing, that made the learning curve a bit higher. So we are bringing some GUI back. The Public Folder Management Console is coming in Service Pack 1. We've also added GUI for managing IMAP, for managing POP, for managing clustered mailbox servers, for configuring the transport server, for configuring availability settings in CCR environments, and so forth. So some GUI is coming back. Some other things that are gone, we cut some connectors. There's no X.400 connectors. There's no Lotus Notes connector, although we do have a brand new Microsoft Transporter Suite for Lotus Domino that you can get that will serve the migration purpose from Notes Domino to Exchange, or for that matter, to SharePoint. And the group-wise connector has also been cut. Public folders, again, they are fully supported, but one of the ways in which we've de-emphasized them is we made them no longer mandatory for all Exchange deployments. Now, public folders are great for holding content, for archiving content, for applications and whatnot, but one of the other things they do is they support the system folders, and the system folders has information like the offline address book and the free busy, the user's availability information. Well, in 2007, we introduced the ability to take the information that was published by the system folders and publish them alternate ways, namely through web services, things like the availability service, which is a new free busy service, or an offline address book, a web-based distribution for that as well. So that means if you're running Microsoft Office Outlook 2007 as your mail client, public folders are no longer required because Outlook 2007 knows how to consume the web-based distribution of these things. It knows it can talk to a client access server to get availability and free busy information. It knows it can talk to a client access server to get the offline address book and so forth. So if you're not currently using public folders, and you're also using Outlook 2007, you could go ahead and deploy Exchange completely without public folders in your organization and not have to worry about managing public folder databases. Another thing that's gone, recipient update service. And when I say this, I want to be very clear on this. It is gone as a separate service. There's still some legacy code inside of Exchange where there is some Rust code that runs, mainly for legacy purposes. So if you don't have legacy systems in place, you don't have to worry about that. But it's not there as a separate service. And so what that means for the administrator, and more importantly for the end user, when you create a mailbox, it gets created right away. You don't have to wait for Rust to kick in and do its thing and stamp attributes and turn that Active Directory object into a mailbox-enabled object. You don't need to wait for that anymore. You don't need to go and stop the service to tickle it to get it to do its thing. It's gone, and mailboxes are now created right away for you. Okay, so I mentioned some of the key differences. So look at the screen snapshot. On the left here, well, on your left, my right, we have the snapshot of the folder for Exchange 2003. You can see it's about 255 megabytes, about 3,480 files. On the right is Exchange 2007 RTM. It's just over 1.1 gigabyte, and it's about 15,000 files. Now, of course, this is 4 server roles installed. Edge is not installed here because it can't be combined, but the other 4 server roles are installed here, and you can see how much larger it's going to have in the file system. Another key difference when you're looking at the Service Control Manager, you'll see many, many more services than what we had in previous versions. And you'll also see that some of the services, things like the event service or the MTA stack service and so forth, those things are gone and they've been replaced with newer services, or in some cases, new services have been added for new functionality, such as the replication service for continuous replication, or the Active Directory topology service for AD discovery and so forth. When it comes time to looking at performance counters, the performance counters are changed significantly in Exchange 2007. There's many, many more of them, as you can see. And there's performance counters for all sorts of little things now as well, not just broad performance counters to look at an individual components, but individual pieces of individual components are exposed as well. And of course, you can see the difference here between the Exchange System Manager up at the top and the Exchange Management Console, which again has that static tree that I mentioned, and those other work pane areas as well. When you looked at the Exchange System Manager and you expanded it, there's an awful lot of white space in there. Not the most effective use of a graphical user interface. With 2007, we've changed that considerably. We're using a lot of the space that, in particular, MMC 3.0 is making available to us. Things like that actions pane, things like the work pane that you see when you have a connector selected or when you are selecting a mailbox server and so forth. Now, I've got a lot of deployment guidelines, but in the sake of time, to make sure we have time for questions, I'm not going to go through all of these, in part because they're well documented and also because I've already talked about many of them. But you can see here for each of the roles, there are certain software requirements that are unique to the server roles. CAS, for instance, needs IIS, whereas the transport servers no longer use IIS. You don't install the Windows SMTP or NNTP services anymore. We have our own SMTP stack, and we no longer have NNTP support in Exchange. So be aware that you've got certain software requirements. Now, in terms of the deployment guidelines, there are a couple I'll point out here. The first two are that for every Active Directory site in which you have an Exchange 2007 mailbox server, you do also need to have a client access server and a hub transport server. And again, if you're not clustering that mailbox server, all those server roles can live on the same physical server. You don't have to have individual computers fulfilling these. Now, in terms of deployment order, we do recommend deploying client access servers first, particularly if you're moving from a legacy version of Exchange. You always want to do the client access servers first. The reason for that is you might not be moving your mailboxes over right away. You might have mailboxes that are on 2003, for instance. Now, the Exchange 2007 client access server knows how to talk to both a 2007 mailbox server and to a legacy mailbox server. It can be the front end to an Exchange 2003 backend server, in other words. But you can't go the other way. You can't deploy an Exchange 2007 mailbox server and have an Exchange 2003 front-end server in front of it. The front-end server doesn't know anything about the new mailbox server, and so you won't be able to get that functionality going. So you do want to deploy the client access server first. To get mail flow going, you'll want to deploy the hub transport server next, and then of course the mailbox server. The UM server role and the edge transport server role, those can be introduced at any time, but again, just be aware that the edge transport server role won't have full functionality until a hub transport server role is deployed, and the unified messaging server won't have any mail flow until there's a hub transport server deployed as well. In terms of the organization requirements, if you're installing Exchange 2007 or Service Pack 1 into an existing organization that has Exchange 2000 or 2003 in it, you do have to have these requirements met. There's certain levels of service packs that have to be met. You cannot have Exchange 5.5 in the organization, and the organization must be converted to native mode for Exchange as well. Means no site replication service, no Active Directory connector, and of course no Exchange 5.5. Now for admin only, these are the RTM requirements. We'll talk about SP1 in a minute, but the RTM requirements for Exchange 2007, you have to just meet the base software requirements. Again, those are things like Windows PowerShell and the Microsoft Management Console. We'll support RTM on Windows Server 2003. That can be the 64-bit or the 32-bit version. That can be with Service Pack 1. That can be R2, or preferably with Service Pack 2. We also support Windows XP Professional as well, both the 32 and the 64-bit, provided you have Service Pack 2 installed. And then the admin-only install gives you the console, the shell, the help file, which is the compiled HTML help file, the counterpart to the online content you get at on TechNet, and the Exchange Server Best Practices Analyzer, which is launched from the toolbox. In SP1, we've expanded that support. We now will be supporting Windows Vista, 32-bit or 64-bit, and Windows Server 2008, 32-bit or 64-bit. Now, there's one important nuance I'll point out. You'll probably hear this show when you go to any of the Windows 2008 sessions, particularly those that talk about differences related to clustering in Windows 2008. Now, what we're doing in Windows 2008 is what we call a clean break in terms of the cluster API. There is no legacy support in clustering being carried forward. What that means from a management perspective is that there's also no cross-OS management. In other words, a Windows Server 2003 failover cluster can only be managed by either Windows XP or Windows 2003. You can't manage a Windows 2003 failover cluster with Vista or Windows 2008. Similarly, you cannot manage a Windows Server 2008 cluster with XP or 2003. You can only use Windows Server 2008. Now, you're probably wondering why I said you can't use Vista to manage 2008. Vista management for 2008 failover clusters is actually coming later. We're waiting for a component called the Remote Server Administration Tools for failover clustering to be deployed on Vista. So what that means right now, if Windows 2008 were out, and there's a very good chance that this remote tool for Vista won't be available at the RTM of Windows 2008. So Windows 2008 will be out. You'll deploy Exchange on a cluster on Windows 2008, and you'll only be able to use Windows 2008 to manage it. You won't be able to use XP, you won't be able to use 2003, and until we release that tool for Vista, you won't be able to use Vista to manage that clustered mailbox server as well. Now, the cross-OS support is controlled at the cluster API, which means there's nothing the Exchange management tools can do to get around this. That means the same requirements for managing a cluster by using the same OS or the same code base of OS applies also to the Exchange management tools. So when you have the Exchange management tools running on Vista, you won't be able to deploy, or you won't be able to manage a remote cluster on 2008 until we have the tool available, and you won't be able to manage any of the clusters on 2003 at all from Vista. There's just no way around it. It's a cluster thing, nothing we can do. Okay, when it comes time to do the deployment, there's all these pre-installation checks. Really the one that I want to point out the most is to run XBPA in advance of deployment. If And of course, you'll only do this if you have an existing Exchange organization. If you don't have any Exchange deployed, XBPA has nothing to look for. But if you do have Exchange deployed, before you deploy Exchange 2007, run XBPA and have it have a look at your existing organization. In order to install Exchange 2007, you have to meet these prerequisites, and it'll tell you if you meet them, but it'll do one other thing for you that no other tool will do. It will look at the kind of organization that you have, and it will categorize it as either a simple, standard, large, or complex organization. So now with Exchange 2007, we've come up with 4 organizational models, and we've defined them in the documentation. You can read what they are. But you want to do that because once XBPA knows the kind of organizational model you have, it will give you a link right into the documentation that will tell you how to transition that organization to Exchange 2007. So we take all the guesswork out of it. You run the tool, scans your org, tells you what kind of org you have, and then tells you how to transition that org to 2007. It could not be made any easier unless we actually came out and pushed the buttons for you. And we are looking into that for a future version of Exchange. No, we're not. I'm kidding. We're not. Okay, I mentioned the install order. Client access server comes first. Hub transport should be right behind it. Mailbox server should be right behind it. Once you have those 3 things in the site, you have mail flow, you've got mailboxes, and life is good. server and edge server, those can be introduced at any time, but just be aware of their additional dependencies on the existence of a hub transport server role for them to do their thing. Now, let's talk a little bit about unattended setup. We've also made a lot of work inside of Exchange 2007 to make setup as easy as possible, and that includes automating setup as well. So you can use our setup wizard, the GUI version of setup. It'll walk you through how to set Exchange up, including clusters, or you can use the unattended version of setup and also deploy Exchange clusters. In fact, if you look at the current documentation that we have online, that is actually for Service Pack 1 now, we're that far ahead, the documentation gives you all the steps that you need to deploy any kind of Exchange server using only the command line. So say you want to cluster Exchange 2007 on Windows Server 2008, and you want to automate the deployment and only use the command line to do that. We have the complete instructions that you need to do that in command line format for Windows 2008. We also have them for Windows 2003, but I like to point out the Windows 2008 one because Windows 2008 lets you do multi-subnet clusters, and we even have the command lines that you can do for that as well. So if you don't want to do the GUI for setup, you don't have to, including clustered mailbox servers. That's a significant difference that we have over previous versions of Exchange. If you wanted to cluster Exchange 2003, you would run setup, but you didn't have a server at your disposal when setup was done. Instead, the administrator had to go into a cluster tool and start creating resources, and when they created the system attendant resource, that's finally when the other resources would get hydrated and an Exchange server object would be created inside of Active Directory. So in other words, the setup experience between a standalone server and a clustered mailbox server was very different. There was a huge disconnect there, and you had to do a lot of heavy lifting in order to get the cluster installed. Well, we've unified setup now. You don't have to go into Cluster Administrator to create the clustered mailbox server. Exchange Setup will do that for you, whether you use the command line or the GUI version of Exchange. The installation will walk you through various stages. It's very comprehensive. It'll ask you if you want to enable error reporting, and by that we mean Exchange error reporting, not Windows error reporting or corporate error reporting. I point that out because Exchange error reporting's footprint is much smaller than those other 2 forms of error reporting. Those other 2 forms of error reporting send almost everything about the box it can detect over to the error reporting server for analysis. Exchange error reporting only sends that information relevant to the error over to the error reporting service. So it's much lighter footprint, and it gets us that information that we need to troubleshoot the problem. Then you'll go through your installation type, you'll choose the server roles, you'll choose whether or not this is a brand new organization or if you're joining an organization. You'll choose client settings. It's going to ask you if you have Outlook 2003 or earlier in the organization, and it asks you that because if you say yes, it'll create the public folder database that that version of Outlook needs for availability, for offline address book, and so forth. But if you say no to that, it won't create a public folder database. it will say, oh, you've only got 2007 clients. You don't need a public folder database. But of course, if you made a mistake, you can always go back and add a public folder database later. But this way, you now have the choice up front. If you know you don't need a public folder database, you can say, no, I don't have any of these clients, and the system won't create one for you by default. It'll then also go through the readiness checks, and in doing that, if the server's internet connected, it will actually reach out to the web to see if there's any updates to our prereq checks and to our best practices, and it'll incorporate that in its readiness checks to make sure Exchange is ready for install. And of course, there's progress and completion steps as well. We have full logging for setup. We store the setup logs in the system drive in a folder called Exchange Setup Logs, and you can use these commandlets to run through those logs and parse them for errors. If you do get any warnings or errors, we do recommend that you look into them and make sure that they're resolved before you proceed with configuration and deployment of that server. And of course, you can always run the Exchange Best Practices Analyzer when setup is done, and it will tell you if anything needs to be reconfigured according to best practices as well. Here's a listing of the Exchange setup log files, what's in them, why you would want to look to them, what they each do, and so forth. If you need to modify an existing server, that can also be done through the GUI. Go into Control Panel, Add, Remove Programs, and either choose Change if you want to add or remove a server role, or Uninstall if you want to uninstall a server role or uninstall Exchange as well. For the post-installation tasks, these are tasks that are going to come up inside the Exchange Management Console and inside the help file if you're following along that way as well. And it's going to walk you through all the different things that you need to do, setting up SSL, configuring Outlook Anywhere, configuring ActiveSync policies, and so forth. Move mailbox preparation. I originally wasn't going to put this in here because this was mainly about deployment planning. But one of the other things I'll just throw out there in terms of deployment planning, because I see we're running low on time and we might actually not get to that slide, is the fact that we are moving to Windows 2008. And the fact that Exchange, if Exchange is on the box, you cannot upgrade the operating system in place, which means if you're running Exchange 2007 on Windows 2003, even if you're already running Service Pack 1, you cannot upgrade Windows 2003 to Windows Server 2008. You have to do a fresh install or rebuild the server by uninstalling Exchange and upgrading the operating system. And in most cases, I think people are going to want to do a fresh install and use the Move Mailbox or the database portability features to forklift the data over to the new box. Some of the other changes that we're making in Service Pack 1, I mentioned at the beginning, where setup would block you after it looked at all the domains that you had in your forest. And if all the domains didn't meet the requirements, even if they were domains you didn't want to install Exchange into, if they didn't meet the requirements for Exchange, setup blocked you. Okay, that was a big problem. As you might imagine, there's a lot of customers out there who might have these extra resource domains that may have legacy domain controllers in them, and they have no intention of ever installing Exchange into them. So Exchange setup really shouldn't be reaching out to try to figure out if these domains meet these prerequisites in the first place. In Service Pack 1, it won't anymore. It'll still look at these things, but now it will ignore any of the domains that don't meet that criteria. As long as the domain in which you're installing Exchange, in which the domain in which setup is being run from, as long as that domain meets the requirements for setup, then you're fine. Setup will complete, and you don't have to worry about bringing these other domains up to spec in terms of the Exchange prereqs. So all the other domains, they can have legacy domain controllers in them. They could be Windows 2000, they could be Windows 2003, RTM, and so forth. But just make sure in all the domains that you're running setup or where you're going to run prepared domain, those domains have to meet the prereqs. There's no way around that. Now, when you're running Service Pack 1 of Exchange 2007, you've got some new operating system requirements. You have to have either Windows Server 2003 with Service Pack 2, which means if you're running Exchange 2007 RTM on Windows Server 2003 Service Pack 1, you do have to apply Windows 2003 Service Pack 2 before you can do Exchange 2007 Service Pack 1, or it can be Windows 2008. Now, that has to be the full version, though. We don't support the server core version of Windows 2008. It has to be the full version of Windows 2008, the version that has the GUI, in other words. Now, as I mentioned though, Exchange 2007 Service Pack 1 is supported for installation on Windows 2008, but Windows 2008 is not supported for installation on Service Pack 1. Okay, what that means is, even though you might be running Service Pack 1, you can't put Windows 2008 on top of Windows 2003. There is no operating system in place upgrade support for that. As long as Exchange is on the box, you have to do a fresh install. And that's particularly true for clusters because clusters are a hard break. Remember, it's that clean break that I mentioned. So that means you can't have a single failover cluster that has Windows 2003 and Windows 2008 in the same failover cluster. So you're either building a new server or you're building a new cluster, and then you're either using Moved Mailbox or the database portability feature. And a Moved Mailbox, we think, is going to be the preferred method because ultimately that's going to result in less downtime per user. Some other things you're going to be aware of, there's some new terminology changes that are coming with Windows 2008. Some of the changes in functionality from Windows 2003 to Windows 2008 have changed. There's failover clustering changes in Windows 2008. There's a lot of them. There's also a topic on how to install the prereqs for Windows 2008 because the prerequisites, while they're the same in terms of things like PowerShell and MMC, the way in which they're installed into the operating system is different. And in some cases, the need to install them on the operating system is different as well. And of course, with Windows 2008 brings with it IPv6 support. And in the case of Exchange, IPv6 is fully supported, but you must also have IPv4 on the box as well. And that topic, the IPv6 support in Exchange 2007 SP1, talks about that as well. By the way, these are all blue and underlined because they're hyperlinks out to the TechNet topics that talk about this, the same topics that are in the chum file that ships with Exchange as well. Okay, and with that, we are right at 7 o'clock, and they are flashing the red light. And I do know that there is a speaker that has to do a tech chat, but I will go ahead and take just a couple questions. And then after this, I'm going to go down to the product pavilion and be in our booth. So if we don't get to your question here, we'll get to it down there. And I would ask you to use the microphones on the side of the room, too. And for those of you without questions who are on your way out, thanks very much for coming. I know you had a choice of sessions today, and I appreciate you coming to mine. So let's start over here.
Well, I have, it's 2 or 3 questions, basically. The 2 of those are directly related to what you mentioned. Back to the 32-bit version of the Exchange 2007, if one is running the analyzer or a readiness check, will we also be nagged by that application regarding that it's a 32-bit version?
Yes, the Exchange Best Practices Analyzer will tell you it's a 32-bit version, and it should issue just a warning. It's not going to be an error, but it should give you a warning that simply states the 32-bit version is not supported in production. But it won't actually know whether or not you're using it in production or not. It'll just give you that warning when it finds it's 32-bit.
Okay, and the other question is a GUI for SMTP management, or do we still have to use the PowerShell?
Well, some SMTP management can be done in the GUI depending on what you want to do, like for instance, accepted domains. If you have a new SMTP domain that you need to accept mail for, there's a GUI interface for doing that. There are some things where you may find using the management shell to be a bit more powerful because typically when you're using the GUI, you're focusing on one thing or maybe one server. When you start to break out and use the management shell, you can get a collection of things and start to manipulate and affect those. So it really depends on what you're doing. There's a lot of strong GUI in there for SMTP management, whether it's things like domains or even things like anti-spam and message hygiene settings. But there are some things where you're going to find it only available in the shell, and preferable in the case of where it's available in both, preferable to do it in the shell.
Okay, I'm plugging up here the mic, but one last question, and if you believe it's out of the scope of this session, I can understand that. It's regarding Exchange 2007 and Microsoft Dynamics CRM compatibility issues, especially when it comes to mail routing. Do you think SP1 addresses those issues, or?
You know, I'm not aware of what those issues are, so if you want to send that to me in email or take that offline, I can look into that. Unless you know what they are off the top of your head.
Well, it's basically the fact that the 32-bit version of CRM couldn't call up the library that was responsible for the mail routing service.
So you're running the 32-bit version of CRM directly on the Exchange server then?
Well, I'm not really sure if the new version of CRM came out, which is a 64-bit version. Last time I checked, it didn't come out yet. But,
okay, well, let's take that offline and we'll figure that out together. Thank you for your question. Over here.
Hello. Just a question about the deployment of Service Pack 1 in a production environment. I mean, are there any dependency on the sequence on how you deploy the Service Pack 1? I mean, start from the edge, then the CAS, or
yes,
and especially about the cluster roles.
Yes, there is a specific deployment order. We do recommend that you do the client access servers first, and you'll see that's a theme that we carried forward way back from the Exchange 2000 days when we said always upgrade the front end servers first. That carries true whether you're deploying a fresh install or whether you're applying SP1 into the organization. You always want to deploy the client access servers first. Then from there, the order in which you do the other servers really doesn't matter too much. At that point, it's going to be dictated by maybe your feature needs. For instance, if you decide that you really want standby continuous replication, you would go for your mailbox servers next. Or if you really want the OCS integration, you'd go for the unified messaging server next, and so forth.
Are you upgrading the passive nodes before the active?
Yes, that's a great question. You always and only will be doing a passive node in the cluster. You never apply any update rollups or any service packs or even any Windows hotfixes to an active node in the cluster. And when we say passive node, we mean a truly passive node. In other words, not only does it not own a cluster mailbox server, but it hopefully won't own any cluster groups at all, especially not the default cluster group, because when you apply Service Pack 1, you will need to reboot at the end of the installation, including fresh installs, not just upgrades. You will need to reboot at the end of the installation, and you never want to reboot an active node because that's going to result in downtime. So the instructions, when you see how to apply SP1 in your environment, there's a specific section for upgrading cluster mailbox servers that walks you through the unique things that you need to do. I'm actually going to be talking about that in the tips and tricks because it can be a bit of an intimidating way, but it's a very cut and dry and easy way of doing it. Where you do the passive first, reboot it, move the CMS over, upgrade the CMS, and then go into the next passive node and so forth.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, one more question, and then we can all head downstairs to the party room.
I have a question about topology where backend servers or server is Exchange 2003 and front end or client access is 2007. Is that topology fully supported for production environment, or it should be used only for migration?
It's absolutely supported in production. Certainly it's going to be the way in which you migrate, because again, you're going to be deploying 2007 on the client access servers before any other servers. But we have to support that in production. We can't force you to migrate at, say, for instance, our pace. You migrate at your own pace. So you have full support. The client access server actually has intelligence in it. It will know the difference as to whether or not it's talking to a 2003 backend or a 2007 backend. And it will talk differently depending on the type of server that it's talking to. So that's absolutely 100% supported.
I see. Thank you.
All right. Thanks very much, everyone, and hope to see you guys down there.